So at this time, we're going to start our 11:05 conversation around racial justice and the wealth gap. I want to apologize that our first speaker could not be here today. That's Dr. Darrick Hamilton, who is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School and is the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. He is also a member of the U.S. Treasury Department's Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. On racial equity. That's the same committee that Dorothy Brown, who we heard from last night, is also a member of. So even though he could not be here, we pre-recorded a conversation between myself and him that we're going to air now, and that will introduce our panel discussion around the racial wealth gap and racial equity.
Hello. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce today a very special guest, Dr. Darrick Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton serves as a commissioner on the New York City Racial Justice Commission, and he's also a professor, the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School in New York. Dr. Hamilton, welcome.
Thank you. I apologize that I'm not there in person, but I'm grateful to be able to present and have this conversation with you.
Well, we're glad you can do this virtually with us. And so I just wanted to quickly just start off by asking you, you have been a scholar and public intellectual, but you're also involved in practical government policy. Could you talk to us about the importance of connecting scholarship to practical governmental policy work?
Yeah, I'm committed to social change. I got into this business not just for the sake of knowledge creation. Now, our identities are our identities. And I guess at some point in college, I realized that I was a scholar, that the love of knowledge was part of my identity. And I had the good fortune and access to pursue that endeavor. But underneath that was a goal to really try to affect change. So, we got to move beyond knowledge for the sake of knowledge creation. And, I'll say this also to my brethren that are academics. We get subsidies, public subsidies that offer us that privilege in so many ways. Even the structure of our employment with tenure affords us the ability to take chances, to be courageous. If not us, then who? So, I think it's not enough to create knowledge for knowledge's sake, especially personally, that a goal should really be to translate that knowledge into action and then ultimately public engagement so that we can get sustainable change that promotes a better society.
Thank you for saying that. And I can call you Darrick for the sake of this conversation. The theme for this year for our Civil Rights and Social Justice section has been economic justice. It is my view that a civil rights agenda without an economic justice agenda is like trying to clap with one hand. And so we have been working to try to bring out the economic justice questions around broader civil rights and social justice issues. So whether we're talking voting rights, criminal justice reform, housing, immigration policy, it's my contention that there's an economic question in all of those issues.
Juan, sorry, keep going.
Could you kind of share your reaction to that, particularly in the context of our value system? Because ultimately, all of these issues are a reflection of our values, what we care about as a society.
Juan, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, the American Bar Association has absolutely been grounded in promoting concepts of justice and rights. We can even use that word rights. But what becomes an aberration or co-optation of the concept of justice and rights is when you pursue them in an incomplete way. Civil rights, political rights, they're essential. But another complement to those two endeavors has to be economic rights. The right to vote, the right to organize in public, free mobility throughout society is somewhat incomplete if you don't have a house, if you're unhoused,
Right.
if you're hungry, if you don't have a job. So we're not talking about handouts. We're talking about enabling goods, just like it's enabling to be able to civically participate. So I love the fact that you're framing this as, a concept of justice and rights in congruence with the great work that's being done. And I'll say this last part really quick, which is one can even impose a rhetoric as well as a structure that's antithetical to justice by emphasizing certain aspects of a framework, civil and political rights, in an incomplete way. So in other words, if one can make the case that we have freedom, we have choice. So we provide people the ability to organize, we provide people the ability to vote. So the outcomes that are attained by individuals and communities are not the results of some oppressive structure, but their choices, their own actions. But in that rhetoric, what we lose is power. What we lose is one of the most critical ingredients, which is resource itself.
Right.
So resource is not only an outcome, it's an input. So if we want a fair, just society, then there has to be some base level of resource by which we expect people and enable people and facilitate people to have so that they can engage in transaction.
Right.
If you go into any transaction without resource, then two things can happen. That's not a negotiation. You're either at the whim of somebody's charitable inklings, or you're at the vulnerability of their exploitation.
Right.
So this is not socialism. This is not capitalism. This is basically engagement. And again, I know I'm long-winded with this answer, but I'm passionate about it, which is one has to have some base level of resource, some base level of economic rights, if you're going to talk about human rights, because it's incomplete, inadequate, misleading if you do not have consistent with political, civil, social, cultural rights, economic rights.
So I remember years ago, I heard someone say that having the right to go to college means nothing if you can't pay for it. Having the right to eat at a fine restaurant means nothing if you can't pay for the meal. That's kind of what you're really undergirding here, is that these rights mean nothing if there's no resource or economic justice component to them.
Exactly right. And there's certain outcomes and inputs that we might deem particularly essential. Like clearly in the 21st century, a debt-free college education is a necessary ingredient to have it is a productive, fulfilling life. It is almost a necessary ingredient. I don't, people I hope understand what I'm saying. And then even aside from it as an input, as an outcome in and of itself, it is something that an enlightened, wealthy society that we have, particularly in the US, can be afforded to all our citizens. So we emphasize it in terms of what it can do, education, but it as an outcome is important enough. And again, that's part of a fulfilling life with dignity and agency. Education becomes one of those ingredients. A restaurant, clearly the ability to eat is important. Right. Maybe we don't have to afford everybody as a right a 5-star restaurant, right, but everybody as a right should not be hungry in the United States. And then, last point I'll make on this is not only about economic security, it's about production. It's about capacity. We enable people to do dynamic things. We enable our economy writ large when we invest in our most treasured resource, and that's its people. And this is not Darrick being highfalutin. This is not Darrick being some left-leaning bleeding heart. There is empirical evidence that suggests that when we strategically, as a public, invest in people, not only does it benefit them, it benefits our economy writ large and all of us.
Right. Well, as you know, people are viewing this recording and this conversation right before we're going to begin a discussion around the racial wealth gap. You've done a lot of work and scholarship in this space. In fact, in 2010, you published an article titled, "Can Baby Bonds Eliminate the Racial Wealth Gap?" My first question is, what is a baby bond? So people will know what you're referring to. We want to define our terms, right? But then secondly, you wrote that in 2010 when we used to use this term called post-racial. I haven't heard that term in a very long time. I think you and I would agree, recent years have shown us that we are far from a post-racial society. So kind of share with us where you were then and where you are now on that topic. And then could you connect that to the broader question around how do we engage public policy as one aspect of finding solutions to closing the racial wealth gap?
Right. And Juan, that was an excellent question, multi-layered. And if I forget something because of my feeble mind, please bring me back and,
All right.
and we'll try to address it. But okay, so baby bonds. Baby bonds are essentially trust accounts that are publicly managed for newborns that become available to them when they're young adults so that they can invest in an asset that will passively appreciate over their life, like a debt-free college education, like a down payment for a home, like some seed capital for a business. So a couple of things about the name. The credit for the name should go to the late Manning Marable.
Oh,
who was
yes.
he was the person that came up with that alliteration.
I've read his work. Yeah. Oh,
It's
yeah.
technically not a bond, but it flows well. It sounds great.
Okay.
And you know, in its design, there was political elements to the design of it. It was in a period of our society where we were grounded in the respectability politics, and you know, you couldn't imagine to far-fetched back then in the context of welfare reform. So strategically, baby bonds was structured in a way where, you know, how are you going to talk about the respectability politics of a baby? But the baby hasn't done anything, so that was a design.
Right.
But the essential part of baby bonds is providing capital so that somebody can get into a vehicle of asset appreciation over their life.
Over time.
Most Americans with wealth generate it in a way that's passive.
Right.
Not that they engage in active savings, that income that they don't consume going into their savings. That's not the main way that most Americans generate wealth. The way they do is passively through paying down a mortgage and their house appreciating, getting into a job that affords them a 401k with employer contribution to their retirement, or being able to actualize their ingenuity, their great idea in some entrepreneurial way.
Right.
So understanding that the most critical ingredient for wealth is wealth itself. It is wealth that begets more wealth. That's the design of the policy. So basically, access to wealth should not be the exclusive domain of the wealthy. And the racial wealth gap, right? So the racial wealth gap is indicative of the accumulation of a past that has denied Black people access to resources and government policies that have ceded them assets that appreciate over their lifetime. Right. And what's more, on the political side, and this is really relevant to the audience at hand here today, is that when Black people were able as a group and individuals and communities to accumulate assets through overachievement, et cetera, it never had the political codification of white people. They were always vulnerable to predation, to even malfeasance from the federal government, if we think about Black farmers. So baby bonds becomes a prospective way that ensures in perpetuity that all Americans, regardless of the race that they're born into or the income that they're born into, have some seed capital to begin a lifetime of building economic security. That's its purpose. And it's taken off right now. So 2010, I was ridiculed many a times for this idea in multiple ways. And at this point, you know, this is a lesson. Stay committed to justice, and that Overton moment of when a policy can become relevant actionable, you can't predict. So at this point in this endeavor, some states are taking action. There's federal legislation. It might not happen wide scale tomorrow, but I don't know when it will happen. But I commit to it because I do understand that we need something like that. Yeah, and then we could talk about post-racial. Let me pause for a reaction, but I know we got to get to post-racial also, and then wealth as it relates to this notion of economic rights. You know, it's central, but it's not all end all. And then also another thing to bookmark, and then I'm gonna calm down on, is reparations, how reparations maybe fit together.
I wish you could be here with us today in person to have this conversation in more detail. What your comments remind me of are the words I once heard from Mark Morial, head of the Urban League, when he talked about generational wealth. And he said that our white colleagues are able to pass wealth down to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He said, Black people, we always start over every generation. You know, your parents may help you get through college, but then you're on your own, right? And that's really more of a recent phenomenon also. That's not a historical reality for our community. And, you know, I'm one of the few, not few, but I'm one of the, among my colleagues, I've been told, I'm one of the few in the context of my grandparents were college graduates, even received master's degrees from Jackson State. Most of my peers, and I'm in my early 50s, that's not their story. Their grandparents were not college educated. And so we're still really in that first generation, maybe second generation of African Americans in particular, having the opportunity to have the educational platform to generate wealth and grow their wealth for their family and their immediate family. Did you kind of react to that, particularly in the context of this, what we now know is not a post-racial society?
Yeah, I'll start with the difference between income and wealth. So we've made tremendous gains in a relative sense, particularly between the period of 1940 to about the early 1970s in reducing income inequality in particular. And over that period, the typical Black male went from earning about 40 cents on the dollar to a white male to about 70 cents or maybe 80 cents on the dollar. What's happened since the mid-70s is that gap has remained flat. Right. But nonetheless, that tremendous progress afforded some access to middle-class status for Black people in the domains of income, but never wealth. And part of the point of why we emphasize wealth is for the reasons that you and Mark Morial have emphasized, is that wealth becomes something that is a stock that can be transferred from one generation as opposed to a flow that like income that is really periodic as opposed to being a stock. So that's one thing. One thing two is that even when Black people accumulate wealth, for those few that do, it doesn't have the political codification and protections from malfeasance to be protected and passed down from generation to generation. And one other point I want to make is that for white people that were able to enter middle-class status in terms of assets, this is important. It was government policy that facilitated that. So the narrative that one can lift oneself up by the bootstrap in terms of a trend, you find exceptions, and we highlight these exceptions in a way that doesn't offer counterfactuals of many other people that did the same things that those exceptions did, but didn't receive the outcome. That's a dishonest understanding of our society to just highlight the anecdotes without the other counterfactuals.
Exactly.
Right. So all that framing suggests that, going back to your original question, we are not post-racial. That right. But I'll say that we've made progress since 2010, even in that notion, the politics of respectability, even in the frameworks of why racial disparity exists. And a lot of credit goes to that Black Lives Matter movement. That wasn't just about police actions and oppressive use of state force, but linked that oppressive use of state force to our larger economy in an intricate way, and led us to understand that this respectability politics of being able to pull oneself up by the bootstrap is not only factually incorrect, is an oppressive rhetoric.
Right.
And Juan, one last point. Well, actually, I want to make two last points on this. One is, in terms of education, even after the mid 70s, we've still seen progress in terms of education. That hasn't plateaued. Black people have relatively gained in terms of education, even to this day. There's slight ebbs and flows, but
Right.
that is decreasing. So, you know, what's the point of that? The point of me saying that is education has become a political ruse. If we focus on two solutions for the black people, education and entrepreneurship. Well, education is important in its own right, but it as an ingredient will not address the racial wealth gap in its entirety. In fact, the racial wealth gap rises with education rather than diminishing. So that's a political trope, and that's not to diminish education at all. And then I forgot the other point, but that's probably a good thing because I keep talking.
Well, my last question before we turn to our panel, I want to ask you, could you speak kind of generally about the work you're doing on the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity that President Biden put forth through the Treasury Department? Specifically, are there federal policy solutions that you want us to be aware of or that are in the pipeline that the American Bar Association could perhaps join in supporting once we adopt the appropriate ABA policies resolutions?
I mean, this conversation has gone full circle and concludes on the right note of post-racial society. So I would not have fathomed 10 years ago that we would have been at a place where the president's first executive order is that all federal agencies, one of the first executive order, has to account for race and its measurement, as well as plan to implement its policies with regards to equity. So the federal government acknowledging race as an element of both input of the ways in which we implement policies and outcomes in the ways in which these policies lead to distributional unfairness is progress, right? That's indicative of society recognizing that we're not post-racial and that race is a critical element in our distribution. And in that endeavor is the formulation of this Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity. We have access to the Secretary of the Treasury, which is perhaps the most critical branch in relating to American life outcomes. You know, our most potent fiscal tool is the tax code. We think about the tax code as revenue collection, but in earnest, it is the manner in which government strategically directs resources in the most potent and sustainable way. And what has been problematic is that tool has been distributionally used in a way that's antithetical to where we began, which is investing in our most treasured resource, which is people. In other words, our tax code is tilted towards corporate elites as well as the elite amongst us. So one can redistribute taxes in a way to promote a more dynamic, more just society. That's one example. So let me try to sum this up and say that the real good news is that in our public discourse, race can no longer be sanitized or is less sanitized than it was in 2010. And this notion of all you have to do is work hard, play by the rules, and you'll be fine. We're at a point where we understand that economics, politics, and identity group stratification, the ways in which we divide people into cursory identities like gender, race, sexual orientation, have always been iteratively linked and are not separable. So when we think about our legal codes, when we think about our public policy, That's a necessary thought process to design, implement, and manage policies in a just, inclusive way.
Dr. Darrick Hamilton, you have been a tremendous voice in this economic justice conversation. Thank you for your contribution. And quickly, lastly, how can people find you or follow you and also, of course, read your work?
Well, I wish we were there in person so we could shake hands and
Right.
and talk. But Twitter, my handle is at Darrick Hamilton. We have a website at the institute I direct for which you can get on the mailing list. And I certainly hope we stay in touch, because for a movement, we need partnership.
Absolutely. We'll stay in touch. Look forward to our continued partnership and working with you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.